Well, thank you. And so you are in for a full hour, okay? I'm just going to warn you because I have got a lot to pack into this hour. We are going to be addressing the question, are people born gay? The truth about biology and sexuality. And I wanted to address this question because honestly, this is one of the most common questions that I get nowadays because we live in a sexually saturated and a sexually distorted and perverted society. And almost every person is directly affected by these sexual issues in one way or another. I mean, if you just look at the recent headlines, right? Was their child a boy or a girl? Naya's parents want to let Naya decide. She gets to decide her gender. All you need is loves, plural, the truth about polyamory. Good Morning America promotes child drag queen, right? This child performs in nightclubs as a drag queen at the age of 10. Right? This is the society we live in. More U.S. teens are rejecting boy or girl or gender identities, a study finds. So they're neither boy or girl, they're something else. LGBT movement now claims to represent family values, labeling Christians dangerous. Right? Pride Month is here, and Target has everything and your family need to celebrate. It's being celebrated everywhere. Homosexuality and transgender are being promoted, obviously, in our secular society. But guess what? It's not just in our secular society. It's being promoted as normal in our Christian society, in our Christian world as well. Matthew Vines, God and a Gay Christian, he said, being gay is not a sin. Right? It's okay. You can be a gay Christian. Revoice, I don't know if you've heard of them before. They're an organization that supports, encourages, and empowers gay, lesbian, same-sex attracted, and other gender and sexual minority Christians so they can flourish while observing the historic Christian doctrine of marriage and sexuality. What? That's a total paradox, right? Gaychurch.org, where you can find an affirming church, right? If you're LGBT, find a church that affirms what you believe. And this poll tells us that U.S. acceptance of gay, lesbian relations is the new norm. The message is loud and clear, right? Homosexuality, transgender, polyamory, it's all normal, it's all acceptable, it's all okay. So if they're normal, right, then there must be a biological basis for it, correct? It's not a choice, it's just the way some people are born. When homosexuality stopped being a mental disorder, that was actually declared in the late 80s. Science confirms homosexuality is normal and there is no treatment. Well, of course there's no treatment because I don't think it's a problem. It's not a disorder, so to speak. And in fact, there are many different types of sexuality, right? Nowadays, it's not just homosexuality, right? That's the one we're most familiar with. But we've also got new terms like asexual and demisexual and pansexual and queer and questioning, right? All these different terms. And this applies to the transgender movement as well, right? Being transgender isn't a mental illness. What's sick is a society that treats it that way. Because after all, people are just born that way, right? Lady Gaga has this as one of her songs, and in it says, her mom is talking here, it says, there's nothing wrong with loving who you are, she said, because he made you perfect, babe, meaning God, because God makes no mistakes, right? She says, I'm on the right track, baby, I was born this way. Just love yourself. I was born this way. And she is a professing bisexual. Okay, but here's the conundrum for Christians. If homosexuality and transgender are not disorders, if there are indeed biological causes for it, scientific reasons, then science proves that, so to speak, then how can we say it is abnormal and it is a sinful choice if people are just born this way, right? Is the Bible wrong about this? And when I was researching this, I thought, wow, this is really similar to the claims made about evolution in millions of years, right? That science has proven it, so therefore we must accept it. That the Bible is wrong, or that we need to reinterpret the Bible to make that work. But as with any other issue, we need to realize that this is a worldview issue, right? It's what glasses are we looking at the world through? We either start with God's word or we don't. And that affects how we interpret and understand people's choices, actions, behaviors, and even the scientific evidence. However, unlike the origins issue, which deals with past events, which we call historical science, what we're dealing with here with the biology or sexuality is this falls under the category of observational science, right? It deals with present event. So we can use actually the scientific method and see if there is indeed a genetic or biological basis for homosexuality and transgender, and thus whether these behaviors are normal and people are born that way, or if they are indeed sinful choices. So I want to give you an overview of how I'm going to work with this, basically, because this is an enormous topic to fit in 1 hour. But I'm going to be focusing mainly on the biology and the science, okay, behind this. And many of our other speakers are going to be dealing with many of the other aspects of this, mental, emotional, spiritual, all of those things. And when I was putting together this presentation, I realized that before we can even talk about the genetics or the biological basis for transgender and homosexuality, we have to talk about some more foundational issues from a biology and scientific standpoint. So we're going to talk, first of all, are gender and sex really different? All right? Are there two distinct genders and sexes? What about gender-sex abnormalities? Because that's an argument that's used a lot to say it's normal. And then we'll get to the questions of, is there a genetic biological basis for transgender? And the same question for homosexuality, and then I will conclude. So we have to understand some basic foundational issues before we can get to these bigger questions. So first of all, are gender and sex different? We live in a fallen Genesis 3 world, and people all the time, I see this all the time, are trying to separate sex and gender, right? So sex is something you're born with, that's biological, but gender is something you choose, right? That's what we're being told by our society. Gender is a social construct. And in an article in the journal Sex, Gender, and Medicine on the Stanford Medicine website, the author said this: sex is a biological trait that is determined by the specific sex chromosomes, okay? So XX or XY. But then he says gender, on the other hand, is socially, culturally, and personally defined. So it's something separate, it's different. In a Scientific American article, they said this: biological sex basically is a sex chromosomes, right? That's what determines. That identifies each of us as either a genetic male, XY, or as a genetic female, XX. Now notice how they say genetic, right? Is they're going to try to differentiate this from gender, because then they go on to say gender, which is meaningly different from biological sex, is a subjective feeling of maleness or femaleness, or as we see in our society today, something else entirely. And in case you need more understanding about the differences between gender and sex, we have the gender unicorn. This is being used, and this is no joke, right? This is put out by the Trans Student Educational Resources. This is being used to teach children this, right? Because children love unicorns, right? That's like a huge thing today. Why not the gender unicorn? See, here's how they do this. They say sex is biological, okay? Gender, however, is very different. That has to do with your identity and your expression. So it's divided into two parts. And then they add a third aspect. Then they say you have your sexual orientation, and that's who you're physically attracted to or who you're emotionally attracted to. Now, please understand this, okay? I really want you to see this. Technically, by the way this is laid out, you could be a biological male who identifies as a female, expresses it as other, is physically attracted to men, but emotionally attracted to women. Doesn't get confusing at all, does it? No. But the Canadian Center for Gender and Sexual Diversity decided the gender unicorn wasn't diverse enough. So they came up with the gender elephant. Now, what's the difference? Here's the difference. This blows me away. They say there's a spectrum even for biological sex. Now, instead of the gender unicorn, which had a little piece of DNA there, now we have a leaf. Okay? Because they are going to say there's actually a spectrum when it comes to male and female from a biological perspective. Now, I'm not saying there aren't biological abnormalities that can occur when it comes to biological sex, and we'll talk about that later. But listen to what this organization says about the change in the imagery. When it comes to biology, variation and diversity is the norm, not the exception. I like to remind people that just like how all our faces are unique, so is our biological makeup. Intersex is an umbrella term for anyone with a very wide range of characteristics and life experiences. The norm? This variation is the norm? No, it's not. I mean, scientifically, I can show you that. I can show you statistics to back that up. That is not the norm. It doesn't even make any sense, right, from a biological perspective. And they say there's some spectrum that's as widely varying as a person's face or other external characteristics. What does that have to do with your biological sex? right? And how would life experiences affect your biological sex? They're saying things that don't make any sense. They just are not scientifically accurate at all. It is absurdity, and it's truly a case of people doing what is right in their own eyes. Right? They became fools, and they have worshipped the creature rather than the creator. They want to replace God with their own ideas. And like I say, we see this very, very much so in the creation evolution debate. People want to say, well, a day in Genesis, that can mean long periods of time, even though the context is clear in Scripture that it only means a 24-hour day. And there are many other examples of that as well. And why? Why do people want to do that when it comes to the creation evolution debate? All to accommodate evolution in millions of years. All to say man's ideas are right and not God's clear word. Well, the best way that I know to determine the definition of a word is to look it up in the dictionary, especially medical dictionaries, if we're going to talk about medical terms. And so if we look at the Merriam-Webster dictionary online, and this is their medical dictionary part, if you look up what gender means, it says, what's the first definition? Sex, since one. All right? So let's look up what it says. Either of the two major forms of individuals that occur in many species and that are distinguished respectively as male or female. Yep. Because gender and sex aren't different. They're the same thing. They relate to the same thing. They're talking about the same thing. Stedman's Medical Dictionary, the most recent edition, says gender, category to which an individual is assigned by self or others on the basis of sex. Compare, the CF means compare, compared to sex. Sex as the biologic character or quality that distinguishes male and female compared to gender. Yeah, because they're the same thing. The fact that people are separating them is totally artificial. Tabor's Cyclopedic Dictionary, gender, the sex of an individual, i.e. male or female. Sex, the characteristics that differentiate males and females. Gender. So it's totally artificial that people are trying to separate these two things. They are synonymous. And we would expect them to be synonymous from a biological scientific standpoint because the Bible doesn't separate gender and sex. Right? We know that God created male and female. That is a biological definition, right? Male and female. That is their biological sex. And then when he was creating Eve, it says the man, while he was asleep, right? God took one of his ribs and made a woman and brought her to man. We see man and woman, male and female, his and her. Right? We see all of these things connected. He said, this is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman. He didn't call her man, right? Because she was different, because she was taken out of man. And what did God say about this? It's very good, right? We have to remember that. So sex and gender are equivalent. In a biblical worldview, there is no distinction between the two. Female is equated with woman in Scripture, and she and her, the female pronouns. Male with man, he and his. So the separation of sex and gender is a man-made construct. And that's true from a scientific, biological standpoint, and that's true from a biblical standpoint. And again, because the Bible is true, we expect science and all these things to confirm and support it. So I'm going to use gender and sex interchangeably because I'm starting with a biblical worldview. All right, now let's talk about, are there really two distinct gender and sexes? Now, our society would have us believe there are not, that there are more than just male and female. According to Tumblr, there are 112 genders. Did you know that? I want to read a few of these just so you can understand. I don't say this lightly. This is absurd. Okay, the absurdity to which this is being taken. So, ambonuk means you identify as both a man and a woman, yet neither at the same time. Okay. Apkonsu gender is a gender where you know what it isn't, but not what it is. The gender is hiding itself from you. Okay, it gets even better. You can be heliogender, which is a gender that is warm and burning, or hydrogender, a gender that shares qualities with water. What does that mean? Perigender, identifying with a gender but not as a gender. Okay? And varangender, a gender that seems to shift or change the moment it is identified. And I don't tell you these things to make fun of these people, but I want you to understand the absurdity of all of these genders, and I want to help you know that people are very confused, right? They're very confused, and they very much need the Lord and the truth of His word. That should tell us that very plain and clear. Now, you might be thinking, well, how can people think this? Because everyone knows from a biological standpoint, there are two human sexes, two human genders. They have sex, and that's how babies are made, right? That's how we continue to procreate ourselves. True, but now there are efforts even to get around that. And this article just recently came out, same-sex mice have babies. All right, this is a picture of a mouse born with no male DNA contribution. The DNA actually came from two females, and then those mice went on to reproduce and had healthy pups. So they seem to be very healthy individuals. Now, I'm not going to explain all the genetics behind this, even though I'd love to. But I don't have time, all right? But they had to do some genetic editing to make this work. They actually had to make some of the female DNA look male to get it to work, which should tell you right there we need male and female, right? But the obvious question is, this is mice, so is this possible in humans? There is a chance in the long run. The research may even lead to the development of ways for same-sex couples to reproduce healthy children of their own. You know, it seems like in our society that we are trying to find every way possible to do what is right in our own eyes, even to the point of denying basic biology, right? Basic biological scientific facts. But the biology is crystal clear on this, right? This isn't rocket science. There are only two distinct genders and sexes. So there is a normal, every human being, a normal complement at least of chromosomes is 23 pairs of chromosomes. So we have 22 pairs of autosomes and 1 pair of sex chromosomes. So again, basic biology, XX is female, XY is male. And if we look at what's called the karyotype, a karyotype is sort of a snapshot, a picture of all the chromosomes, we can see females, the only difference, all the 22 other pairs are what are called autosomes. So we have XX in females, and then we have XY in males. Now, the female is actually the default during embryo development. Okay, so let me explain what I mean by that. It sounds kind of weird. Only if the Y chromosome is present does an embryo become male. Okay, only if that Y chromosome is there. Because on the Y chromosome is something called a sex-determining region, and it takes effect about 6 to 8 weeks after fertilization. Now, that's not to say that the baby doesn't have a sex or a gender up until that point. It's just not known from an outside perspective, right? They don't have the male or parts yet, basically, if they have a Y chromosome until that point. And that sex-determining region inhibits female anatomical growth and induces the formation of male anatomy. Okay, so that's how we get boys and girls, so to speak, separately in the womb. Now, I'm assuming in a room full of women that are teens and older that you are fully aware that there are two distinct sexes from an anatomical standpoint. I'm not going there, okay? I'm assuming you know that. But I want to look at a few ways, and this is certainly not a comprehensive or exhaustive list, that males and females are distinct on physiological and mental levels. And many of these differences result because of the differences in sex hormones and their levels, which is in turn determined by the difference in the sex chromosomes. Okay, it's all related to that XX many times and XY. Now, please know that I'm not saying that the traits I'm talking about are exclusive to one sex or the other, but they seem to be commonly associated with one sex versus the other. Okay, let's talk about some physiological differences. Females tend to convert more energy to stored fat. Males tend to store it to muscle, all right? Males tend to have more sweat glands and dissipate heat faster. Females have thicker layers of subcutaneous fat and withstand cold better. Now, this is what makes, though, females better at endurance sports because of the way that we store energy. Males tend to be better at sports that require short bursts of energy. And fat, ladies, it's a good thing, right? Actually, people who don't have enough of it tend to struggle with infertility, okay? It is somehow related to fertility in women, so there's a good reason for fat, after all. All right. Males tend to have higher red blood cell counts and circulating clotting factors. Females tend to have more stored and circulating white blood cells. We produce antibodies faster. We get sick less and for shorter periods of time. So you know what this means, ladies? Man flu is real. The same, all right? So, but this makes sense from a design perspective. What are males typically involved in? They go out and fight, right? War. They're involved in building things. They're involved in protecting us. It's good they've got more red blood cells and more clotting factors, okay? Because they're more likely to get injured. Women, on the other hand, tend to be more social. We go to the bathroom together, okay? So, I mean, we're social, we're interacting with kids more, so that means we are exposed to more germs. So we need to have those good white blood cells there. And it's important to know and understand these differences because this explains why probably men and women have different symptoms for the same disease and respond differently to medication, because we are designed differently. There are two distinct ones. Females tend to have more connection between their brain hemispheres and between brain cells. Now, just let me get... It's a fact. It's a fact. And they integrate information from multiple sources better, which may lead to what we call women's intuition, and that we can multitask better, okay? So it's a biological fact that it's called the corpus callosum, okay? And so there's more connections between women in their brain hemispheres. Now, men, their brains tend to be more lateralized and have fewer connections. Just wait. And they have more straightforward thinking. They can respond quickly, tend to be more single-minded and less distractible. But here's the thing, ladies, both are good, right? Because God designed us that way. He called it very good. We don't want the world to be a bunch of women or a bunch of men, okay? We want it to be both. Now, probably all of you have heard of this book, right? Men are from Mars, women are from Venus. Now, I'm not endorsing this book, okay, or what it said. But it focuses on the fact that men and women are different, okay? This is a biological fact. It is a physiological fact. It is a mental fact, right? We are different. And this is hardwired. Studies reported in Stanford Journal showed all of this as part of our inbuilt design. They said boys and girls 9 to 17 months old, an age when children show few of any signs of recognizing either their own or other children's sex, nonetheless show marked differences in their preference for stereotypically male versus stereotypically female toys. Because we're designed that way, right? It's just male or female. And that shouldn't surprise us, because when God was basically saying, not necessarily to Adam at that point, but that he was going to make Eve, he said, "It is not good that man should be alone. I will make him a helper comparable to him." He didn't say, "I will make him a helper the same as him. I will make him one comparable to him to complement him." Right? Adam gave her a different name because she is not the same. She is woman, and he called it very good. We should never condemn these differences. We should celebrate them. It is a good thing to have that input and to have that thinking and to have the way that men and women are designed. Both of us are made in his image to reflect God fully. You realize, when he created Adam, that was not adequate. He needed Eve, right? Man and woman to reflect his image fully. One of the ways we see this, God is nurturing, okay? Many verses point to that. And if you look at the spectrum of nurturing, women would tend to be more on the end of more nurturing, men on the not as much nurturing. Now, that's not to say there's not some overlap, okay, and men and women in the middle. Some women are less, some men are more, all right? But we tend to reflect that part of God's image more. Elizabeth Elliot stated this: "These two people, Adam and Eve, together represent the image of God. One of them, in a special way, the initiator, the other, the responder. Neither the one or the other was adequate alone to bear the divine image." And that's what we need to think about when we see men and women. This makes a whole image, right, of God in this world. The difference is good. Sameness is not. And we need to celebrate it because God called it very good. But I will say there is one area that male and females are alike, that we are the same. We are both the same spiritually, right? There is neither Jew nor Greek. There is neither slave nor free. There is neither male nor female. For you are all one in Christ Jesus. We are all sinners, right? And we all need to be saved by the grace of God. That is true. That is a way that we are alike. All right, so we know gender and sex are the same. We know there's only two distinct genders and sexes. We can show that definitely from a biological, scientific standpoint. What about gender, sex abnormalities? What can happen when this goes wrong? When a person doesn't just have XX or XY, or their physical characteristics are ambiguous. Because the fact is, we live in a fallen world. And I'm going to share with you the most common ones, but just keep in mind, these are rare. They typically affect less than 0.1% of the population. And remember when I said earlier how the gender elephant, they said, oh, the biological spectrum, the variation is the norm. It's less than 0.1% of the population. It is not the norm. Okay, it is abnormal. So the first one I want to talk about is hermaphroditism or intersex. All right, this is the case. Now this can occur in males. They're genetically XY, females, they're genetically XX, or individuals that are chimeras. Now, this is a very, very rare and unusual thing that can happen, but sometimes what happens is their individuals are born that have some cells that are XX and some cells that are XY. And that happens because in utero, a male and female twin have combined, typically, to form an embryo that is many cases still appears either male or female, but when you look at the cells, they actually have, it's called chimera. There's actually differences. Some are XX, some are XY. It's very rare, but it can happen. So hermaphrodites are born with both ovarian and testicular tissue. We don't really know what the cause of it is, to be honest, because genetically they're typically one or the other. They're still XY or XX. It is 0.02% of live births. Okay? It is a very rare case that does happen. There's congenital adrenal hyperplasia that occurs in males and females. Again, genetically, they're still one or the other, but they appear the opposite sex outwardly. So they're XX, but they look like a male, or they're XY and they look like a female. And that's due to insufficient or excessive sex steroids. It depends. And that is 0.006% of live births. That's what I'm saying. These conditions are extremely rare. Then we have androgen insensitivity syndrome. This only occurs in males. They are male, XY, but they appear female outwardly. And that's because their tissues don't respond to the male hormones, but they still respond to female hormones. All of us have certain levels of testosterone and estrogen, whether you're male or female. So in these males, they just don't respond to testosterone. That's 0.005% of live births. So it's very rare. Turner syndrome, this is in females. They only have one X, though. That's what makes it different. But they clearly exhibit female characteristics. They just lack an X chromosome, and that's 0.05% of live births. Then there's Klinefelter syndrome. That's in males. They have 2 X chromosomes and a Y chromosome, so they have 47 chromosomes. But they are male, okay, from the outside, and that's 0.2% of live births. And then you have even the more rare, okay, if it could get rare, we have 46 XX males. So these are males that are born with 2 X's. And the reason that they are male is because a piece of the Y chromosome broke off and got onto the X. And it was the part that had the sex-determining region, okay, the SRY. So even though they have 2 X's, they have the piece of the Y for maleness, so to speak. So they have male characteristics, but they tend to have very small testes, no sperm, and so they're not going to be able to reproduce because of that. And it's 0.005% of live births. So it's a very rare condition once in a while. But again, they would still be male because they have that SRY region. And then you can have the opposite. You can have XY females because they have a mutation in the SRY on the Y chromosome. So they have female characteristics, but again, they have no menstrual cycle, no eggs, no secondary sex characteristics, and that's 0.004% of live births. So these are legitimate conditions. I'm not denying that. And many times parents and doctors, a lot of times, are not even aware of these conditions at birth because they don't discover it until puberty when they don't develop certain secondary sex characteristics. And I'm going to be honest, sometimes parents have to make very hard decisions. It's just a fact of life. They have to choose a sex for a newborn that is hermaphroditic. They have to wait for a genetic test or something like that. These are challenging and difficult situations that people face because we live in a sin-cursed world. And you know what? We need to show these parents and these children grace, mercy, and love as fellow image bearers in a fallen world. Right? It's a sad state. But like I said, did you notice these conditions are very rare? We're talking 0.004% to 0.2% at the most. We should never argue from the rare and the abnormal to justify transgender and homosexuality as somehow normal. And I'm going to show you shortly, what's interesting is many of these individuals that do have these legitimate chromosomal abnormalities, they don't identify as transgender or homosexual. So they don't even have that. Even though there might be some biological basis, they don't. But that being said, are there some genetic biological basis for, is there a genetic or biological basis for transgender? So we've discussed some of these foundational issues, I know, in very short order, but I want to move to these questions as, is there a basis for these things? So we're going to start out with transgender first. And one way that people try to give support for the idea that transgender is normal is they look at the animal kingdom. And they say, well, after all, from an evolutionary standpoint, we're nothing more than animals. And so if transgender is normal in the animal kingdom, then it should be normal, it should be considered normal in humans as well. And one way that they try to justify this is through hermaphroditism that occurs in animals. And there's two forms of this. There's traditional hermaphroditism, which an individual is both male and female. Okay, and this occurs in things like snails and slugs and worms and fish. Right? It doesn't typically occur in mammals, just in these types of animals. And then we have something called sequential hermaphroditism, which they actually change sex. So this is protundry, in which they're born male and they change to female, or protogeny, in which they are born female and they change to male. But as you can see, these are things like fish and flatworms and snails and butterflies and frogs, starfish, okay? Not much is actually known how this happens on a genetic or hormonal basis, but they seem to be responding to some sort of environmental cues. So for example, the only male in a school of fish dies, and the largest female will change sex to replace that lost fish, okay? Because that's like necessary for survival. You have to have that. Or a fish that typically lives in pairs, like clownfish, the male will wait for, if the female dies, the male will wait for another fish to come along. If that's another male, then one male will change to a female so that they can mate and produce offspring so they don't have to leave the safety of the reef. It is a good survival strategy. That's what it's designed for, right? Because these animals live in a fallen world just like we do. Obviously, among humans, this isn't an issue, right? We're not living in these survival types of situations that they are. And among humans, there are no examples of any kind of natural sequential hermaphroditism. And like I said, true hermaphroditism, where they're both male and female, is an abnormal condition. In animals, it's considered normal, okay? It's not a problem because it's designed for survival. Now, the other way they try to justify this by looking at the animal kingdom is opposite sex expression in animals. So this is when animals pretend to be the opposite sex to gain an advantage. Okay, so they appear that way, and this occurs a lot of times in snakes and lizards, fish and birds, again, what we've already talked about. Males typically imitate females, and the reason they do this is to reduce competition, to have better mating opportunities, and better access to territory. So they'll pretend to be that for a little bit, right, to get in, to get the female or whatever, and then they'll be male again, okay? They'll act male again, so to speak. But again, that's designed for survival in a fallen world, okay? That's why they're doing those things. Now, so there's no really good argument for transgender being normal in humans from looking at the animal kingdom, right? It serves a totally different purpose for a totally different thing. Not many studies, honestly, have been done looking at the biological or genetic reasons for transgender in humans because the phenomenon is fairly recent, which should clue us in right there that there probably isn't a biological or genetic reason because we would have seen it a lot sooner than this, right? That should indicate right there there's something not right. A very recent and highly publicized paper on this topic was this one, Molecular Karyotyping in Children and Adolescents with Gender Dysphoria. Now, karyotyping is a genetic analysis, okay, to look at the genomes. And the study was done to see if they could genetically screen children and teens that have gender dysphoria and see if there's a genetic basis underlying it. Now, before they could do that, they summarized some of the other genetic screenings that have been done on transgender adults. And it was really interesting. One of the things that they found in individuals that have sex chromosome abnormalities, like I just talked about, okay, Klinefelters, Turners, all of those, right? Only 0.8% of those individuals identify as transgender, 0.8. Okay, so even when it might seem that there would be a biological basis, even those individuals don't really struggle with that at all, not much at all. And yet over and over, I see people try to use sex chromosome abnormalities to justify transgender. But just having one doesn't make a person transgender. It's rare, okay, 0.8%. And if when they looked at other chromosomes outside of the sex chromosomes, in males they found 1.4%, in females they found 2.3% of transgender adults have chromosome abnormalities somewhere else. So it's very, very low, and they don't even know that that's related to them being transgender, okay? They don't know that. So the conclusions of the authors on the basis of their current screening that they did with children and teens and the previous screenings that you see here They said this karyotyping, okay, of those with suspected gender dysphoria failed to detect any readily discernible disorder of sexual development. Therefore, it has minimal clinical utility. In other words, genetic screening to detect gender dysphoria is not helpful because there is no known genetic basis. Now, another paper that looked at this, Transsexualism, a different viewpoint to brain changes, actually looked at how the brains of transgender individuals change after they have been involved in that lifestyle for a period of time. And they also, in this paper, looked at some other studies that have been done previously on transgender and homosexuality to try to, again, they're trying to find a basis for it. They say, well, these studies that we've looked at, studies on twins, birth order, which we'll talk about a little bit later, familial groups, all of that, they're sparse and the results are inconsistent. They said, and they looked at 11 studies that had been done over 10 years and said, well, it's just the information out there is not really good. They said there's no clear and distinct genetic relationship with transsexualism and sexual orientation has been observed up to the present time. There's just no basis for it. And they're including homosexuality in this as well. So these two studies that I've shown you are very representative of all the research that I reviewed, trying to find, I really did, I tried to see, is there a legitimate genetic or biological basis for transgender in a whole? And it's just not out there. Studies are typically small, they have inadequate control groups, or they only represent one ethnic group, so it could be an ethnic variation you're picking up on in the DNA, not necessarily related to transgender. Now, I think another support for this, that it's not biological, is the fact that so many people who do identify as transgender, they undergo sex reassignment surgery or they take hormonal treatment to become the opposite sex, and guess what? They regret it. Almost without fail, they regret it, and they have high rates of suicide. One paper said this, persons with transsexualism after sex reassignment have considerably higher risk for mortality, suicidal behavior, and psychiatric morbidity. It says that our findings suggest that sex reassignment, although alleviating gender dysphoria, may not suffice as treatment for transsexualism. And I could have shared many, many more quotes that are very similar to this. If it's truly genetic, if it's truly biological, sex reassignment surgery should resolve it. But it doesn't, because it just makes things worse, right? It makes people regret it even more. So is there a genetic or biological basis for transgender? And the answer is no. There just isn't. Now, I want to move on to homosexuality because there has been a lot more research done in this area to look at this particular question. And again, to start off with, one way that people try to get support for this idea is by looking at the animal kingdom. Because again, from an evolutionary standpoint, we're nothing more than animals. So if there's homosexuality in animals and it's normal, then homosexuality in humans is normal too. That's how they're trying to justify it. It's interesting, if you go to Wikipedia, they actually have quite an extensive list of animals displaying homosexual behavior. And they actually cite scientific papers that purportedly affirm this in mammals and birds and fish and amphibians and reptiles and insects. And these are only select animals according to Wikipedia. Now, when I looked at these lists, I thought, if all these animals have homosexual behavior, how do we have any animals? Saying. I mean, it doesn't quite work. If they're not mating with the opposite sex and having offspring, it's a problem, right? I mean, how do you have any animals? And probably the most popularized homosexual animals are penguins, right? And why? Because penguins are cute. Seriously. And you know what? Penguins are a great way to get kids to think about it. That's why they do it. Like this book, And Tango Makes Three. So this is about Roy and Silo. They are chin-strap penguins at the Central Park Zoo. They built a nest and attempted to hatch a rock, but obviously that wouldn't work. So they were given an egg from another pair, and Tango was born. Now, what the book doesn't tell you that eventually they broke up and Silo paired with a female, okay? Because that keeps it going. And there was another pair in the news recently down in Australia with I'll pronounce it right, Gentoo penguins, Spen and Magic. They also hatched an egg that was given to them, Spengic. Now, they've done studies on this, research, to look at male-male pairings in penguins, and they say typically they don't last very long, okay? They're a temporary thing. In one study, they said it may be due to high levels of testosterone or a disproportionate number of males. This research study looked at 75 pairs of penguins. Only 2 were homosexual, and later they were observed to break up and be in heterosexual pairs. So it's actually not as common as what they might have us believe. And obviously, again, it wouldn't be good to continue homosexual pairings because then they can't reproduce and the colony would die, right? I mean, that's just basic science. And saying that these penguins are homosexual and broke up, that's anthropomorphizing, right? We're totally putting human traits, human things onto animals. Even the caretaker of these Australian penguins did this. She said, "We're not going to discourage any companionship for our penguins. Love is love." Okay, here's the thing. Male penguins are not willfully choosing other male penguins because they love them and want to be in a relationship with them. That's a human trait, okay? That is not something that penguins do. And do we really want to make the argument, all right, let's think about this, that if we observe a certain behavior in the animal kingdom, that makes it okay behavior for humans, right? Because you got to think about this. Animals eat each other. They kill their mates and their offspring. They eat their young, okay? They exhibit violent behavior toward each other. If we're going to be consistent, then why aren't all those behaviors okay in humans too? You cannot pick and choose if you're going to make this argument. And it poses a really big problem for them. But let's say, for the sake of argument, right, that homosexuality is biologically or genetically determined. How can you explain it from an evolutionary standpoint? This poses a big problem, right? Because a major tenet of evolution is that you reproduce and pass on your genes to the next generation. That's kind of hard to do if you're a practicing homosexual and you're not marrying and reproducing with the opposite sex. How do you even pass on homosexuality if you're not reproducing with the opposite sex, right? And these authors of a paper on this said the existence of homosexuality amounts to a profound evolutionary mystery, since failing to pass on your genes, that means that your genetic fitness is a resounding zero. Because that's how it's determined in evolutionary terms. It's an evolutionary dead end. It should be selected out according to evolutionary rules, because those people that have the supposed gay gene or genetic variations don't reproduce. So how do evolutionary proponents try to explain this? Because they believe evolution is true. That's not going to stop them, okay? They're going to find a way to make it fit, right? Find a way to make it work. So one theory that has been we'll see it's problematic, is the kin selection theory. And that theory said that homosexual men tend to treat their nieces and nephews better and pass on some of their genetic information through their siblings. Okay, so even though they're not passing it on, the siblings are passing their genetic information on. So they did research to find that out. It turns out whether they are homosexual or heterosexual men, they treat their nieces and nephews the same. They don't treat them differently. So much for that idea. Okay, moving on. This one I've seen several times now, and this is called sexually antagonistic selection. So they say if there are man-loving genes or genetic variations of some sort, women that have them, okay, when they have those variations, they tend to have more sex and thus more children. Men, when they have it, tend to be more caring men, but it can go too far, and then they can become homosexual as a result of that. So what they're saying is that the disadvantage to men is outweighed by the advantage to women. So in this theory, homosexuality is a side effect of a trait that is beneficial to women. So that's why it's kept or selected for by evolution. But again, the research studies that look at this are very small, so it's questionable how valid this is. And even the researchers said, but it doesn't account for homosexuality in women. Okay, there's hardly any research on that whatsoever. And so the authors of this study said this. They said, right now, there's no all-inclusive solution to the Darwinian mystery of why homosexuality survived. Homosexuality seems to arise as a result of various perturbations, that's disorders, in the flow from genes to hormones to brains to behavior, all of which seem to survive as side effects of various traits that help heterosexuals pass along their genes. So here's how they're explaining it from an evolutionary standpoint. Homosexuality, let's say, has to be abnormal, because from an evolutionary standpoint, you can't pass on your genes if you're practicing homosexual behavior. And so maybe homosexuality is just a side effect that helps heterosexuals. That's the best you can come up with? I mean, really? And I've read more than this article. This is from 2008. I've read more recent articles looking at this, and nothing changes this overall conclusion, right? It's the same thing. They just haven't come up with a better or a different story, because that's all this is. It's a story to try to explain homosexuality from an evolutionary standpoint in order to normalize it. Right? That's what they're trying to do. So even though they can't really explain it from an evolutionary standpoint, there have been many studies done to try to find a genetic or biological basis for homosexuality, mainly in men. There are very few and far between in women. So we're going to look at the ones just that deal with men. And obviously, I don't have time to talk about all of them because there's a lot of them out there. So I'm going to discuss just a few what I believe to be representative and also well-known studies that have been done on this. 2 historical studies as well as 2 more recent studies looking at this. So the first study we're going to look at, and don't get lost in all the language of this, okay? I'm going to explain this very simply. This is what I'm going to call this the Dean-Hamer study, okay? So this was a genetic study that was done in 1993. And he said that there's a region of the X chromosome called XQ28 that he believes is linked to homosexuality. That, in other words, variations in that region are associated with homosexual behavior in brother pairs. So he said in 83% basically of brother pairs that were homosexual, they had variation in this portion of the X chromosome. And he wanted to look at the X chromosome because males only have 1. So there's nothing to mask its effect like there is in females where they have the other X. So the conclusion that he came to was there may be a genetic cause for homosexuality based on variations in that region. All right, what are the problems with the Hamer study? First of all, small sample size, 40 families. That's nothing when it comes to scientific analysis. You always want more to make it more valid, okay? Over 92% of the individuals were Caucasian non-Hispanic, which means these just could be ethnically related variations and have nothing to do with homosexuality. The individuals that they got for the study were self-identified volunteers that responded to ads. That is not random sampling, okay? And you want that for scientific studies. So they're violating a lot of the norms for scientific studies is the problem with this. And any good scientific study should be reproducible. This one isn't. Okay. In 1999, the Rice study failed to find any linkage that he did. Only 55% of the brother pairs that were homosexual had those variations, so that meant 45 that were homosexual did not. So it's about half and half. And then in the 1999 Bailey study, they only found it in 9.2% of the brother pairs. So it was even less, and these studies were better because they had more people involved and because they had more random sampling. So when you get a better study, basically, it falls apart, that idea. Now, the other historic study, and these are quoted all the time, the Hamer and LeVay studies, like I see them everywhere, even though they're from the 90s. So this is a 1991 neuroanatomy study where he looked at the differences in hypothalamus between homosexual and heterosexual men. So the hypothalamus is a cluster of neurons in the middle of the brain, okay? And what he did was he looked at a specific part of that called the INH3, which is like a cluster of neurons. And he found that in heterosexual males, that cluster was 2 times larger than it was in homosexual males. Now, what is the problem with this study? Again, I don't know why 41 seems to be the magic number, but they only looked at 41 people. Now, they had to presume their sexuality because in order to measure the weights of certain parts of your brain, you have to be dead, okay? So they were taking these from deceased males, and they presumed their sexuality. They don't actually know for a fact that they were homosexual. Many of them died from AIDS, so that's why they presumed that. But heterosexuals can die from AIDS too, so problematic. And the sizes for both the homosexual males and the heterosexual males were within the same range, right? And so I'm going to show you that. So what I mean by that is some heterosexual men had a small INH3, some homosexual men had a large INH3. And so if you look at this, the actual results, so every little like dot on there or triangle stands for an individual. And M stands for heterosexual male, and HM stands for homosexual male. So you can see they're within the same range, right? You got some smaller, some larger. And so it doesn't seem to be that much of a difference. Now, you will notice that in the homosexual males, the INH3 tends to cluster towards the smaller end. But here's the thing. These are individuals that were supposedly already practicing homosexual males. How do you know it isn't a result of their homosexuality rather than the cause of their homosexuality? You don't know that, and so that becomes a problem. Now, I want to move on to more recent studies. So we'll look at 2 recent studies. This one just came out, I think this is 2018, where they did a genome-wide study. So they're looking at all of the DNA. Oh, it's 2017, sorry, genetic study, the Alan Sanders study. And they found certain variations in regions of 2 genes that they say these variations were found more often in homosexual men. And the genes are involved, one is involved in the development of the brain, and one is involved in thyroid metabolism. And, okay, so what are the problems with it? All right, first of all, once again, we have a small sample size. For a complex genetic analysis like this, you have to have a lot of people. And they really didn't have that many to do that. All participants were of European ancestry. Ugh, I hate that. I don't know why. I mean, you want variation. You want to look at multiple people from different ethnic backgrounds so you know if what you're seeing is really true or just part of the variation of that ethnicity. Here's the other thing. They don't know if these genes that produce proteins, if they have any role in sexual orientation. I mean, one's for thyroid metabolism. I don't know if that has any role with homosexuality. Even the author said the current study's top 2 association peaks with these 2 genes, though these potential connections are best characterized as speculative. Yet what did I see in the media? They found it, right? They found a genetic basis for homosexuality. But again, even the authors say it's potential and speculative. Now, the last study I want to look at is this one, which just came out in 2018. It's the Bogart study, and they looked at a specific brain protein. So this is a 2018, actually it's an immunology study, and they looked at something called fraternal birth order effect, right? So let me explain what that is. Homosexual men, it is postulated, tend to have more older brothers than heterosexual men. And so they say, well, the mother must develop antibodies against a protein important for the development of the male baby's brain. And she does this when she is pregnant with her first son. When she gets pregnant with subsequent sons, the antibodies act against the protein and inhibit it. That's what antibodies do. So they'll bind to something and inhibit it from functioning properly. Therefore, the subsequent sons, tend to have homosexual behavior. Okay, that makes sense? So mom develops antibodies during the first pregnancy with a male, and then during subsequent pregnancies, those antibodies affect the proteins in those males. So that's called fraternal birth order effect, and that's the one you see a lot that they're trying to prove. So they propose that the mothers with homosexual sons that were not firstborn sons will have high levels of antibodies against a male-specific brain protein called NLGN4Y. Now, I will say, it is interesting they chose to look at this particular protein. At least it may have something to do with this, because it's on the Y chromosome, so it's only in men. It's expressed in the fetal brain, they know that for a fact, and it is involved in how neurons talk to each other in the brain. So at least it seems legit, the protein that they're choosing to look at. There's a good reason to study it. So what did they find? Well, it turned out that the mothers of homosexual sons that had older brothers had high levels of antibodies against that protein. But here was the problem. The mothers of homosexual sons with no older brothers also had high levels of the antibodies. Oops. Okay, that kind of is a problem. It kind of blows the whole fraternal birth order effect out of the water on that. So I'll show you the actual results. So the mothers of gay sons with no older brothers, you can see the level there. And then the mothers of gay sons with older brothers, you can see that level. There's not that much difference between those columns. In fact, at the very top, they show these lines with little asterisks on them, and they're trying to show significant differences. That's always really important in science, okay? In order to be valid, you've got to show a significant difference. There's not a line between those last 2 columns with an asterisk. You know why? Because there's no significant difference. So there's no significant difference in the amount of antibodies against this protein produced by women who have sons, older, firstborn sons, and then subsequent sons with homosexual behavior versus those that don't, right? So again, it was a very small sample size, and we still don't know how that protein affects sexual orientation. And the authors blatantly say that. It's not like they're trying to hide this. It's really the media, I think, that wants to promote this agenda. They get all excited about these studies, but even the authors themselves will say it's not certain how this might operate at the cellular level to basically be involved in men's sexual orientation. So it could be totally coincidental. So is there a genetic or biological basis for homosexuality? And the answer is no. The results are typically negative, showing no connection at all, or they're inconclusive at best. And even the researchers, if you read their papers, will admit that genetics or biology is only one aspect, and many other things like nurture, the role of the environment, past experiences, abuses, all have a role in determining someone's, they would say, sexuality. So in regards, just to kind of sum up all of that part, the Council for Responsible Genetics, I think, summarizes this really, really well. And looking at this issue is there a genetic or biological basis for transgender or homosexuality? They say the scientific argument for a biological basis for sexual orientation remains weak. The lesbian, gay, and bisexual community does not need to have its deviance tolerated because its members were born that way and cannot help it. Rather, society must recognize the validity of lesbian and gay lifestyles. We need an end to discrimination and acceptance of all human beings and a celebration of diversity, whatever its origins. So what are they saying? Homosexuality, transgender, it's not genetic, it's not biological, it's choice. Yeah, everyone did what was right in their own eyes. We know that. So I want to conclude with this. There is no genetic basis or biological basis for transgender or homosexuality. In a biblical worldview, it is sin. Right? It is very clear that these are sinful choices. And I just selected a few verses, right? There are many, many more. That a woman shall not wear anything that pertains to a man, nor shall a man put on a woman's garment. That is an abomination. So transgenderism is sinful. Homosexual behavior is sinful, right? The women exchange the natural use for what is against nature. The men leaving the natural use of the woman, burned in their lust for one another, men with men committing what is shameful. So there is no basis for that. We know that God made two sexes, two genders, and that they should not be separated, and that men and women are different, and that is very good. Right? Because we are created in God's image as men and women to bear his image fully. Now, here's the question some people might be thinking, yeah, but what if someday we found a genetic or biological basis for homosexuality or transgender? Would that make it okay? Because I get asked that question a lot. And my answer still is no. Because Scripture is clear that these are sinful behaviors. And people ultimately have a choice because God does not lie, okay? And God tells us what is right and what is wrong. We are all born sinners. Guess what? Every single person on this planet struggles with sin. Everybody. Whether it's transgender, whether it's homosexuality, whether it's adultery, whether it's lust, whether it's lying, cheating, stealing, right? Alcoholism, it doesn't matter. We all struggle with sin. We're all born sinners. And we have a choice because God gave us a will, and we can make choices for or against God. And if we don't choose Christ in his word, then we are committing sin. We are against him. And the hope for everyone who struggles with same-sex attraction and homosexuality and gender dysphoria, it's Jesus Christ, right? But the free gift is not like the offense, for by the one man's offense many died, what Adam did, much more the grace of God and the gift by the grace of one man, Jesus Christ, abounded to many. Because we all descend from Adam, we're all sinners, but because of what Jesus Christ did, we can be saved from our sin. Right? Whereas in Adam all die, even so in Christ all shall be made alive. And that freedom from sin is possible because what did Paul write? No temptation has overtaken you except such as is common to man, but God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able. But with the temptation will also make the way of escape that you may be able to bear it. God doesn't say, oh, you just have to do this on your own. You're on your own. To try to defeat sin. No, he says, I will help you with this, right? I will make this possible for you. And earlier in 1 Corinthians, Paul talks about a list, right, of all these sins. Some of them I just mentioned, right? Fornicators, adulterers, homosexuals, sodomites, thieves, covetous, drunkards, revilers, extortioners. He says these will not inherit the kingdom of God. These are sins. But then what does Paul say after that list? And such were some of you. But you were washed, you were sanctified, you were justified, were past tense, right? Because this doesn't have to be their eternal state. And I'm not trying to say that people don't suffer from gender dysphoria or homosexual desires. I'm not going to say that because they do. These are real problems. But what I am saying is that there's no genetic or biological basis. And even if someday we would find evidence of that, of some sort of influence, it's still at its root a sin problem. Right? It's because we live in a fallen world that this has happened. The scripture is clear on that. And just like we all suffer from a sin problem, we need to have compassion and we need to help these people because what the world presents in affirming their sin is lies that lead them directly to hell. And we need to present the truth in love because that is what Christians are called to do. And we need to show them the true love and freedom from their sin, and that the only true hope that is found in the gospel of Jesus Christ. That's what we need to be doing. And I want to help you know, again, some resources. I know Ken mentioned some. Remember, almost everything is 20% off. You can even get a box and fill it, and you can put boxes over here. Oh, some are already over here. Okay, that's good. It's good because we want to equip you. Ladies, you're going to be dealing with this if you're not already, right? I get these questions all the time, and so this is important. A couple of things just to mention out too. A few years ago, we're recording these for DVD, so these will be available on DVD. We will have a study guide that goes along with it, so you can share it with other people. And we did this a few years ago as well, dealing with many other topics, including homosexuality, in our Embrace conference. We also have the Homosexual War, a biblical view, looking at this in more detail, and Hope Amid Despair, the legacy of Eve. We don't have to have that sinful legacy. We don't have to have that continue because of Jesus Christ. All right. Woohoo, I got done in an hour. Okay. Nailed it. All right. So I have a few things for you, and let's see if I can remember. All right, thank you.